You can skip to page 7 of your script.
That's right. Yeah. How did you do step 3 in less than a second? It says you're supposed to wait 30 seconds. Like, never you mind. I have a time. All right. We are now streaming. Thank you for the patience. Okay, so we are calling to order at 9:07 a.m. on June 4th, this regular meeting of the Easton Reading Region 9 Joint Boards of Education Policy Committee. First item up for us is the approval of minutes from the May 21st, 2021 Easton Reading Region 9 Boards of Education Policy Committee regular meeting. Do I have a motion to approve?
Sure.
Thank you, Chris. Do I have a second?
Sure.
Thank you, Maureen. And any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor? Very good. And it's approved unanimously. It takes us to public comment. No members of the public being present. We'll go to committee member comment. And hearing none, we'll go to discussion of possible action. We start with our trusty CABE model policy review agenda item. We have been in the midst of discussions that generally fall inside of the 9000 series, and we actually see a lot of sort of suggested language that applies here, but specifically we're knee deep in the process of understanding sort of the specifics of how we govern ourselves, not as individual boards, but how we govern ourselves when we meet together to work in concert for common purpose and thinking about the administration sort of support of our central office staff, et cetera. So that will, and we have a member of the public joining us as well. So I will share my screen. We will jump into some of the discussion that we've been working on. Before I get too deep down that path, I do want to pause for a minute and ask Dr. Pearson-Ugal, is there anything that we need to save time for in administrative updates?
I do have a couple of updates. I don't think it will take me longer than 5 minutes to provide those updates. So as long as we save that time, we'll be fine. Perfect.
We will save ourselves 10 minutes at the end to just make sure that we have time. Good. Okay. So just to make sure we're all sort of refreshing our memories, given the dozens of board meetings we've all had in the intervening week. So we've been going through these topics. We've got, just going to scroll down to the end, so 28 different topics that we've highlighted. We've been trying to create sample language. That sample language we intend to put in front of the 3 boards as soon as possible to get some understanding or to get some agreement on as many of them as we can. Things as mundane and we think uncontroversial, like what happens when we meet together in terms of who's going to chair that meeting, how we set an agenda, what our process is for recording minutes, and then getting into things that could have a little bit of disagreement about sort of what that process should be. So review and approval and reopening of the central office budget, or hiring of senior central office personnel, or the approval of salary and benefits for senior central office personnel. I actually think we're coming to a place where we have been developing a shared understanding, and part of that, I think, is that we've just sort of documented, not just here, but also the negotiating committee when it was charged last year. To do work to not only sort of take on the role of negotiating when the need arises for the 3 boards, but also for defining a process. And we fleshed out a process that we have sort of the long form process, the short form process. And that in and of itself starts to suggest like, hey, there are many things that need to happen, and sort of bringing transparency there, the sort of suspicion that can occur when people don't understand how we went from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, like that's, I wouldn't say completely dried up, but diminished significantly. which is really good because no one is trying to hide anything. We are very interested in doing these things, in a transparent and public way, and making sure that we're serving the public interest and doing the right thing for sort of all involved. Okay, so we have sample language for all these. I'm open to anyone who suggests, hey, let's revisit X, Y, or Z. But I do want to make sure that we just focus on these 3 blank spots. And I have a point of view about this. I don't know if it's going to be shared by everyone here, but anyone have anything to say before I move on?
Just an observation in the context of the past 12 days, whatever it's been. The tri-boards, to a certain extent, exercise the recess and reconvene option, in part because it was 2:00 in the morning, but in part because I think collectively it was probably the right thing to do for a number of reasons. And I found that after a long and mildly bruising meeting, we had a still somewhat long, but not brutally long, but perfectly sort of understood meeting where everybody felt heard, said their piece, and resolution was found. And I think that it is a model for how this methodology can be effective. It's also, I think, partially a function of the fact that we're able to convene over Zoom, which makes it easier to schedule things on relatively short turn times, which is harder when everybody has to say,
Right.
can I physically be in the same place on such and such a day?
Right.
Mhm.
Yep, I agree with that, and I think there was a sort of sidebar discussion with a couple of members recently about some of this is easier to do in person when you can see people, and all I could think was yes, true, but there's also a lot of utility that we found in being able to sort of quickly jump on a Zoom and sort of notice the meeting, of course, like you normally would, but the sort of ability for me to go from this session directly into work at 10:01 every Friday, that's the only reason I can do this. There's no way that I would be able to participate.
Ditto.
And that's how we started doing these on Google Meet back before
That's
the pandemic, because
Right.
we said we have to find a way to do the work. And this
That's
is the
right.
only way we're going to do the work while still maintaining any sort of other employment.
Right. That's right. Right. So, we should be mindful of that. I think there are probably going to be voices who talk about, our ability to meet together, and, it's all wrapped up in a lot of the things we're talking about here. Or there will be voices say, back to in person all the time. And it's like, it's not that. It's back to in person, when we need to be in person, and, let's leverage the technology that seems to, we got a lot done over the last year in the face of a, overwhelming amount of sort of work that was in front of us. So
Right. This would have been
There's
a
something to
substantial
be
lift
said for
without the
when
pandemic.
trust break, sorry, Chris, but there's something to be said that for when trust breaks down, being in person is probably the better option.
Yeah.
But when a group is functioning well and
Yeah.
there aren't issues of what someone's motives are, or when we're just convening to do the work, period, it is much easier in this format.
yeah, agreed. I also think a part of the antidote for trust breaking down is document it, do it publicly, make it crystal clear. That you can't question somebody's motives if you literally see them doing the process of thinking in front of you, and you get to be a part of the process and all that. So, okay. So these 4 spots here, not saying this is my final thinking on this, or my final position on this. Let me throw this out there and see if it floats. I don't think we need them. I think we remove them, and I think if we don't remove them, then I think we need to suggest changes to individual boards' bylaws, because it is my position that even if we adopt these policies, and we would be adopting these policies in each board, we would need to be making those changes for each board's policies in their bylaws to allow some mechanism that essentially allows the basic vote of that board to be overruled by other boards.
Right.
And I just don't see that flying politically.
I mean, I think the alternate is to say that this MOA or whatever however it gets structured, supersedes any bylaws that conflict.
Right.
And if it is deemed to be a suspension of those bylaws to the extent that they are coterminous, and if they're approved by 2/3, you don't need to amend the bylaws, you've effectively said that this sits above them.
Yeah.
As a sort of technical point.
Yeah.
But I see your thinking with respect to if an individual board has its own autonomy to do what it needs to do, in what universe is it reasonable to expect that other boards are going to tell it what to do?
That's right.
I kind of err towards the Chris initial camp rather than the Chris subsequent camp there on that. I think we need something beyond recess and reconvene, and it may not be all four of the options.
Yeah.
But we need something because we've been, shall we say, fortunate to get through what we've gotten through without reaching, deadlock again. And I would not want to see the deadlock interfere with the functioning of the boards in a way.
Mm.
And sometimes when you have a route out of deadlock that's clearly prescribed, you avoid the deadlock.
Yeah. There needs to be a safety valve. And I think of it in terms of discussion back when I was appointed to Gwen's seat on the Reading board. There was a question as to whether or not the board was going to deadlock 3-3 on who was going to be appointed, and whether that would then turn to the Board of Selectmen to make an appointment. And nobody, the Board of Selectmen inclusive, wanted anything to do with that resolution.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, ultimately forced a resolution because nobody wanted to go to the safety valve.
Mm-hmm.
And so the existence of sort of the nuclear option existing was sufficient motivation to force a consensus in a more practical way, which I think speaks to Maureen's point of you need something there, even if it's a distasteful outcome that nobody wants anything to do with.
Yeah.
And I think that to try and say I would love for everyone to rewrite their bylaws, but that's going to be another big lift on top of this lift. And I don't know that it's coming in this year.
Yeah.
So given everything that we've been through and the patterns that have developed, we can sort of try to take the patterns and say, hey, these worked, guys, let's enshrine them, rather than go to the separate set of having the three boards draft different sets of bylaws, which probably should happen anyway, but may not happen before the next deadlock.
Yeah.
So timing, maybe?
Yeah, I would say the one of these four options that I don't think requires any change to bylaws is this one right here. Right. So number 27, the formation of a joint committee to discuss items and make a recommendation. That's perfectly reasonable within our existing bylaws, because any joint committee, and it would be a committee of the whole, is still only making a recommendation. So it allows all 21 members to talk, to vote as a block of 21, and for that committee to say, our recommendation to each of the boards is this action. And in a scenario where there are three members, right, and I think that we're talking about Easton here, when there are three members who are dissenting, it could be a sort of 18-3 vote, and those three members, when we get back to, okay, now we're out of that joint committee and we're talking in, Easton, Reading, and Region 9 separate boards, those members could continue to vote that way. No change to bylaws, and, Easton is not participating in that. Or any one of those three members could say, well, I feel this way. I recognize that the recommendation in that committee, and that alone could be, and therefore I will abstain from this vote, or therefore I will vote yay. And it doesn't obligate anyone to do that, but it gives them the ability to do that because they recognize that it is, it's sort of 18-3 vote.
I would be hesitant to do that on an ad hoc basis where it's, we're approaching a deadlock. Let's create a committee for the purpose of resolving this deadlock. I think if you're going to go down that path, you want to, I don't want to say spin, but you want to take this from the perspective of, I'm looking to make tri-board meetings more efficient. And so the tri-board meeting becomes joint meetings of the three boards scheduled coterminously with the ER9 committee. And really the ER9 committee would be doing the work and handling all the motions until the very end. And so you wouldn't need to have three motions in 3 seconds to talk about to get something on the table for discussion and then amend it and then beat it around and then amend it again. You could do all of that as 21 to get to, here is the ER9 committee's recommendation. This is how the motion should be crafted. Okay. Now, can I get that from the Reading board, the Easton board, the Region 9 board? And then it becomes very sort of pro forma at that point, in theory.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's gonna be a lot of educational effort to get folks around
Yes,
to
it
that as a
is.
concept.
Yes, it is. I mean, even I think the ad hoc version of that is easier to get to, but even that requires a lot of education. Everyone needs to truly understand what the authority of committees are.
And so if let's take that hypothetical on an ad hoc basis. Let's say we're looking towards a deadlock and Easton is 3-3 on something.
Right. Yep.
Easton still needs to find 4 votes to create that committee.
Right.
And if
Right.
they see the committee as a way to work around that 3-vote block, that 3-vote block is never going to form the committee.
Right.
Right, and as a even if you came to a common motion and like it would still then have to go back and be voted on by the
Right.
3 boards, and those 3
Right.
people could still vote no. So
Right.
you've just gone in a
Right.
circle.
But the thought
Right.
is that if it's 18-3, they are persuaded to say, I understand that this is not in what I perceive to be the best interest, but because it's important for 3 districts overall, I'm going to either abstain or vote for it, notwithstanding my prior objections.
Right. I wonder, I know Colleen did a ton of legwork to understand where, let me just make sure, option 26 was used, right?
Yep.
So the mechanism. Looking back on each of those issues, with the benefit of hindsight and a little bit of time, I know one of the issues was was it like publishing our minutes online or something like that?
Yeah, publishing documents online was one of the issues that got mechanisms.
Yeah. So I look at things like that and I go, yikes that it was needed for that kind of work. And I think if we had a vote today, I think it would be unanimous. I hope it would be unanimous.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to go back and see why people objected to publishing minutes online.
Right.
I don't want the public to see them. They should have to come to
2002
central
or
office, look at the
something?
minutes. Who knows?
Yikes. Right. So I wonder about, like it seems as though it was certainly in the public interest for us to have that outcome, for transparency and all the things that we talk about, when it comes to making sure that the public's involved and understands what we're doing. But I really have trouble understanding how, without documentation of this process, how that squares with our bylaws.
Because the process becomes a function of the loudest voice in the room,
Right.
not
Yes.
the function of any sort of history.
Correct.
And that's where you get the mechanism is only for the central office budget. Well, history says that that's not true.
Right.
We refuse to participate in the mechanism right now.
That's right.
Okay, now what?
And that's
now
not
the mechanism
okay.
is I say no.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I don't think that's okay. So it either exists or it doesn't.
Right.
And if it exists, it's binding all the time, right? It's not we get to pick and choose when we're using it.
Or if we say it is only for budgetary issues, we say it is
Right.
only for
Right.
budgetary
We can
issues.
pick and choose.
Like,
We can.
Right.
No, but what I mean is in the moment, we can't pick and choose.
Okay.
We need to,
Once
we need to,
we've established the guardrails,
Exactly.
the guardrails are the guardrails.
exactly. And I just don't see us getting any agreement there. I don't see us coming to an agreement that this is actually okay for us to move forward with. I'm happy to propose it as the sort of ultra emergency sort of way to do this. And I think it would have to include language that it supersedes bylaws of the individual boards. But I
do
don't
you think that by
that's gonna
proposing
pass.
it, John, you may get people around the rest of the work for one thing, because it'll be the lightning rod within the work.
Yeah.
And you also, you'll foster the transparency that you want, because if we omit it altogether, it's going to come up anyway.
Yeah.
Right? It's going to come up in the discussion with the wider
Yeah.
boards.
Yeah.
So I think you're sort of compelled to put it in there and have the discussion with the wider boards, because you're going to have that discussion one way or another.
Right.
I think it gets framed as dispute resolution is the knottiest subject here.
Yep.
And we have worked through a number of theoretical ways to do it. And we have
Right.
found problems with all of them,
Right.
which is why, having considered this and this and this and this, we've landed on this as a recommendation, which we still acknowledge is not the best
Right.
circumstance.
Right.
Because there is no best circumstance.
Right.
I agree with that framing.
Do we have a sense of what's the worst that would happen if we went back and looked? I mean, like really, like what is the worst that happens if we're coming to disagreement about the approval of a contract, right? If we're coming to a disagreement about the approval of hiring someone, the worst that happens is the 2 out of 3 boards that are supportive make a decision as to whether or not they're willing to shoulder the burden themselves and have somebody who only works for them.
I think that would fly in the face of having a tri-board structure. So hopefully they would come back to the table and say, this is not the choice. This is not the DEFCON nuclear option extreme. We don't want to kill our institutional structures to get to this approval of a contract. I want to find an example that illustrates your point that isn't that far, that doesn't feel that far to the
Well,
end.
I'm not convinced that that's far from people's minds.
Okay.
I actually think that people have considered that over the course of the last several years, multiple times.
Right.
And,
I think the personnel issue is really where the heads butt as to personnel control and what the sort of, what you're going to do about it mentalities sort of come out. And
right.
the reaction is, well, fine, I'll have my own superintendent, or I'll have
Right.
my own finance director, or my own digital learning director. And, maybe we'll be better off for it.
Well, maybe we need to get the buy-in that that's not what we want, or that's
Right.
what we want to consider before we even go through these.
Right.
Because maybe that's the point that leads to the other points. We all really have to say that we're committed to this structure, or we will continue to reevaluate this structure as we go forward.
Right.
Maybe that's
And
the
maybe
buy-in you need.
maybe that's an argument to get buy-in on a personnel search basis that says that the boards will give a higher degree of deference to the recommendation of a personnel search committee of the whole, so that in the circumstance where the personnel search committee comes out 15-6 or 18-3, 3 members of one board don't get to basically veto that on a tri-board basis. If we agree that a director of digital learning is important, and we agree that 75% of board members are behind, Tom Jones for that position, then we don't want to be in a situation where then when it comes to approve the contract, 3 members of Easton or 4 members of Region 9 or Reading say, you know what, that's not good enough for me. And it goes down 17-4 or 18-3, because that has a cascade of issues, not the least of which is how you sort of cure that from a tri-board perspective. But also,
we need to then get into a bigger discussion a little bit about in what circumstances we may want sort of the minority to have veto power, right? Because that's what's happening.
right, when is that veto appropriate? And the extent to which, let's just sort of play it forward and let's say that that's what happens. The personnel search committee recommends Tom Jones to be the digital learning director. 3 members of one of the boards or 4 members of one of the boards say no. Not only have we sort of blown up that process, but we've also signaled to the broader pool of future applicants for things that why should I put my toe into this water if I'm going to get publicly embarrassed by
Right.
3 people on one of these boards, because that's going to stick with me when I
Right.
go to apply somewhere else.
Right. And that's especially, and I'm not talking about the actions of any of our board members, but I think we have seen, members of the public and members of the not Reading and Easton public willing to pour gasoline on a dumpster fire and sort of delight and sort of eat popcorn as it burns.
Yep.
And like the degree to which we can guard against anyone with that kind of outlook joining the boards in the future, I don't know. Like,
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think there are going to be potentially some interesting changes on Chris's board this fall. I mean,
yeah.
not
Well,
from our
I mean,
side of the aisle.
we all have, seats up, and things change. And so, the degree to which we can understand and help to communicate clearly the consequences of sort of not, sort of believing in the structure that we have. I mean, people need to understand, right down to the value of homes in our towns and the quality of education that our kids are getting.
Like,
Right. I mean, we really do. That's That's actually the framework that I think I would
Right.
start pushing at, John.
Yep.
You know, when do you want the minority to thwart the will of the majority? And might you envision circumstances where that could happen after
Right.
November?
And yep.
Mhm.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No. I mean, I think that that's the backstory in many people's minds in this particular working period, right? I don't think it's the backstory in many people's minds generally, because I think people just do the work to do the work. But in this period of time, the backstory is, hey, I'm concerned, and I'll say this personally, I'm concerned about the board's functioning well under some sets of hypothetical circumstances,
Right.
because I don't know that
Mhm.
that, in my opinion, would be happening
Yeah.
if certain people were substituted in certain places.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think, and you know, I think Stephanie's participation here is really appreciated, because I think you should know. I think Easton and Reading punch way above our weight, and it's because we have this tri-board structure. It's because we can, by working together, we can attract talent like Dr. Pearson Ugal and like Dr. Harrison, right? It's like we are able to put together a structure and a talent pool that we could not either afford or sort of make work as individual boards. You know, yes, we're saving some money as individual boards, but like when you look at the like overall effect on the budget, it's not crazy. That's not it. It's, can you attract people who can really make a difference to the educational outcomes of our students?
And I think that, to Maureen's point, these are, whether people sort of appreciate it fully or not, working boards who
Yes.
do work.
Right.
This isn't a show up once a month and look pretty application. This
Right.
is a lift.
Right.
And there's a temptation amongst folks to sort of say, oh, this is all fun and games. I could just jump in and
Right.
be a pain in the neck and jump out.
Right.
And there are bona fide consequences of that worldview.
Yeah. Right.
Beyond just other people having to do more of the lift. It's the reality of, we are sending messages to the community, to the talent pool for people who we want to work for us, and to the quality of education we're providing, which all trickles down to things like home values and, you know, the all important test scores that people are constantly crowing about.
Yeah.
So
I'm still wrapping my head around what John said, because it's like the opposite of the sort of going line that the tri-boards repel everybody and make it impossible to ever have anybody stay. And I've disagreed with that myself for several reasons. I think there are many other factors that have led to some other turnover, but
I think that there's a line between the tri-board structure being a magnet for talent and the fact that the two towns have agreed to work jointly on education that is a magnet for talent. I think you can get to the same place as a single regional school district as a, you know, from with respect to Johnson.
Yeah, absolutely. My point is, we don't get a Dr. Pearson Ugal or a Dr. Harrison. We just don't attract that talent when it's two schools, right?
Or
when
1,200 kids just in one town.
Samuel Staples Elementary and Helen Keller are great schools, but they're just not going to attract the same when you combine that with Barlow, when you combine that with Reading Elementary and John Reed.
Yeah.
I think it's a complicated discussion, honestly. I think that the tri-board, the tri-district structure has potential for wonderful outcomes for our students, for our staff, for our families, in that there's the possibility of collaboration and strategic planning that might not be possible in a much smaller system with possibly even fewer staff. I also believe that the tri-district structure and the tri-board structure often gets in the way of achieving those goals and what's possible because of the difficulty of coming to agreement and working together in a collaborative nature in terms of the governance, and the sort of bleed between governance and operations that sometimes occurs. And honestly the working conditions for all board members who, you just reminded everyone that these are working boards. You all put in a tremendous amount of time that I think, in my experience from working in other districts, is unusual for boards of education. The number of committees that exist, the great effort that people go through to really work even beyond the committee meeting hours to serve the towns, serve the districts. I think that's phenomenal. And as you also know, those of us who work in central office do what would be in a normal district once 3 times.
Yep.
So the number of meetings, all the things that we've been discussing for many years, that frankly does get in the way often of having a healthy balance. And it might also get in the way, to come back to the point you said earlier, of attracting people, because, I think that we have to be absolutely honest and upfront about the working conditions and the job for which one is applying. And that is a reality. So there's great possible benefit, but I think that those applying for a job should know this is what's expected. And I think that also, comes right down to even building level administrator positions. In many districts, those positions do not participate actively in board meetings. They sit in the audience if they are even expected to attend. And we know in our 3 districts, there's a healthy participation by our building administrators. And that's a part of what I think it gives us that sort of small district feeling, but it also increases the amount of responsibility that we place on building level administrators as well as central office.
Yep. Yeah, and I think a huge part of the work that we've been trying to do with the policy committee and this is to try to streamline that more. If we spend, 8 weeks, that's 8 hours of time here. I think that's a significant reduction in the amount of time. If we can come to some agreement, if we can get the boards to all sort of agree on these rules of the road, then we're no longer spending an hour. And I've been in meetings where we have simply argued about some of this basic process for an hour or more. And so, now if we can point back and say, unless what we're talking about is proposing a new process, then let's move on. And not
Yeah,
spend that time.
it sort of fundamentally comes back to, I'm thinking of the beginning of Tuesday's meeting where Chris had many things that were discouraged or encouraged for members of the public. And at the end of the day, they can be discouraged, but they're still like Gwen Denny, Wayside Lane. I'm going to read the email I sent to the boards. And that for board members is kind of the same thing. Like, I don't necessarily need to hear somebody's entire, thought process and evolution on an issue for 15 minutes, but you can't really stop them if they've decided they want to share their entire evolution on this issue, how I went from point A to point B in 37 steps and eating up 20 minutes of your time, when you could have just voted or said, well, I was here, but now I'm here.
But it's a speed bump.
It's that's a lot of the time suck. Listening to
Yeah, agreed.
And then when you have 21 people who all have their evolution as opposed to 6 people, it's just
yeah.
So getting tactical about this, do we need this language here, or is this enough to have the conversation?
That's it.
Yeah.
I think you're right, John. I think that's enough to have the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think the framing of the conversation is exactly what Chris suggested.
Yep. Okay. All right, then, unless anyone wants to go back to any one of the items. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, let me just ask the question. So if we're framing this as we've considered a bunch of options, none of which are great, are we closing with the clause, but our recommendation is? And if so, what is that?
Yeah, I don't know that I think I expressed my opinion on these, and I don't think that it's changed. I like 27, and I'm comfortable with an ad hoc version of that. And if you can't get the ad hoc version of that formed because 3 people are dragging their feet from one board, then I think that's okay, and like that is what it is. And I'm going back and thinking, like, what is the worst version of what's happening? It's not that schools are shuttered, right? It's if, let's say that some situation where do we start schools or do we not start schools? And two of the districts want to start schools. Great. Well, those 2 districts are going to start schools, and the one district isn't, right? And that's on that one district.
If you've got a central office budget of $1 million that's split 3 ways,
Yep.
and you've got 3 or 4 members of one board who say it shouldn't be $1 million, it should be $800,000.
Right.
And they say there's nothing that's going to change my mind. It's only going to be $800,000.
Right.
What result?
I think in worst case scenario, you're not able to resolve that. You end up with 2 boards saying we're going to go forward, and you figure out your own thing, other board. That's the worst outcome.
The other board does not have a central office?
Correct.
Or do you
Even
land
if
on a
they've
mandatory
contracted with a
minimum in that
superintendent.
scenario?
That has been mechanismed.
You land on a
Right.
mandatory minimum, or you go to a mechanism?
No, the 2 votes, the 3 votes over the central office budget has happened. I remember that happened.
See, I don't think the pressure release valve, the sort of worst outcome, is the mechanism. I think the worst outcome is the sort of the one board having no central office.
Oh
I
yeah,
think that's the pressure that puts them there. I actually think it gives the so the members who are not in favor, who are the sort of bare minimum of 3, let's say, who are saying no, we think it's 800 and we refuse to consider. It gives them an easy out. It gives them a sort of political cover.
Right.
No, you
I
don't.
was
get a
principled
political
about
cover.
this, and it was agreed to over my head.
That's exactly right. And then they get to continue to foment that kind of irresponsible behavior. No, you be on the record, and you've decided that this district has no central office. That's the worst outcome. That should be the pressure. And it's either we need to figure out a way to persuade the other boards to come down to 850 or come down to 900 or yeah.
So take it to the side then and say, now we are looking at offering the director of digital learning a $500 raise next year.
Right.
And 3 people say no.
Mm-hmm.
The result is that person doesn't get a raise, because then they will have that veto forever.
No, I think that the result
Or
is
that board doesn't contribute to the raise.
correct. Right. And maybe even that board doesn't contribute to that contract, which means that board doesn't have that role. And that role is only for the 2 boards that do have that contributed.
But that only works if the contract is expiring and not continuing.
right.
If you're dealing with a multi-year contract, you're
I
not
think
saying
that's-
I'm terminating the contract.
I think that's fine. I think that works, right? If you have, let's say you have a 2-year contract, or even 3-year contract, which is the longest long-term contract we have, right? Then that board is still on the hook for paying for that. I don't know. I mean, do we have any? You want to talk about a mess? What does it look like when you start to actually allocate time? Right. We pay a third.
Right. But if you
Do
start
we get a
charging
third,
time out,
a third of time? I don't think so. Do we want to get into that business? Probably not.
because then nobody's getting 100%. We're all down to 90% because 10% is allocated time.
Exactly right. Stephanie, have you punched the Easton time clock? Okay, now here's the Reading time clock. Now you're really excited about working here.
Well, we've had requests in the past to provide information about how we spend our time over the course of a week, which of course is also a time-consuming task to
Yes,
document.
that's
And
right.
it frankly, it varies. I mean, I know that you weren't really looking for a practical answer here, but it really varies from topic to topic, week to week, and I think that's the trust that you put in us to figure out how to manage our time so that we can prioritize.
Right. So do we have a recommendation? And I'm happy to not be in the majority. I mean, not happy, but I don't like, we vote. So if everyone else agrees it's option 26 or it's option 25 or 24.
Just another comment on 27. It would not be possible to say in the middle of a meeting, we're fighting about the central office budget. Let's call the 27 hotline and form a committee. Because once you form the committee, you'd have to notice a meeting of that committee, which couldn't be the same time.
Right.
So it
Can you
would basically
defer
have to
to-
be part of 23 anyway.
Can we think about deferring to the recommendation of a committee, to default to the committee recommendation in the event that there's a stalemate? If there's a committee that's been formed?
If a tri-board committee makes a
I-
recommendation, then, and 2 of the 3 boards accept it, it's deemed accepted.
I'm hypothetically throwing it out there.
I think it requires a change to the bylaws.
Right, it runs into the same problem, John. Yeah.
Yeah, it requires a change to the bylaws.
Hmm.
And again, it's the same, you're giving political cover to irresponsible behavior.
But on the contrary, John, you know what? There's ranges of irresponsible behavior. And we can't always extinguish certain levels of it.
Yeah.
So in the framework of developing behavior and developing behavioral change, do you want to try to extinguish that behavior to have it substituted with worse behavior? Or do you want to work with the behavior you see on a fringe to try and pull it back?
Yeah, well said.
I think in the language of behavioral change, you want to work with the people you've worked with for a while because they're the ones with whom you have some modicum of trust. And when you move beyond them, you could be substituted with a person who's just a destruction agent.
Right.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I don't mind giving people political cover. I think that, especially right now, when some of our issues are so very lightning rod-y.
That's, yeah, very persuasive.
Not on our side of the aisle.
Yeah, I think that's actually a persuasive argument. So so what do we think? Are we talking about the mechanism and sort of recommending the mechanism, or I am a fan of the sort of this option, but and I am also thinking about there would have to be some language that says this supersedes bylaws, and then that would actually that wouldn't just be a recommendation. That would have to be a policy that we accept. We do a first reading, a second reading, and each of the boards accept. Because otherwise, if this is MOA language, you can't just say, "Hey, by the way, gentlemen's agreement, we're going to override our bylaws."
Well, I think that
I see that point in not wanting to frustrate all the work that we've done by always having an out, and I now agree with that one. I don't know that in this meeting we're going to finish this discussion, or that's my feel on it.
No,
right now.
and we need to give Dr. Pearson you all some time. But we have next Friday. I think we are planning on doing a tri-board meeting on the 14th, 15th, 14th.
Oh yeah, and then the following week, I'm not going to be able to,
Yep.
or not. Sorry, the 25th.
Right.
I'm not going to be able to.
And I
I've got
absolutely
curfews
cannot do the 25th.
Right.
So
Yeah. that's-
before we pivot out of this, I just want to sort of throw out there a concept on the structure of how this ultimately works to see if it can solve for a few of these. What I would perceive this as being is an MOA that is ratified on an annual basis or on a biannual basis or biennial basis when the boards are reconstituted or something to that effect. And in that, each of the boards would agree, among other things, to the extent this is a suspension of bylaws, any bylaws are suspended that this would be in conflict with.
Mhm.
And then on the
Okay.
assumption it carries by 2/3 across, it
Yep.
solves for those bylaw problems without getting really into the bylaw problem and basically says this is the superseding document.
Yeah, I like that. I think that makes a lot of sense, and especially the sort of the revisiting this with regularity, I think makes a lot of sense because we need all members to understand. Here's the
We
rule.
can learn from this and we can tweak it to fit the needs of the boards. The risk of doing it on a regular basis is if you get sort of
Right.
into a conflict about resolving it,
Right.
you've sort of blown the whole thing
Right.
up, but you've just got to be careful about that.
But it's, and I've heard a lot of pushback in the past about, well, we can't constrain future boards from what they, and like, well, that's exactly what bylaws are.
Mhm.
But there's a mechanism to sort of work through that. And I think it's better for us to, instead of expecting these sort of future board members to be expert parliamentarians and sort of understand how to navigate that, we just put this front and center, and every one of them says, okay, here's the rules of the road. We all agree. Good.
And on that January tri-board meeting every other year when the new boards are coming together,
Right.
the first item is ratification of the MOA for tri-board meetings.
That should go on our calendar. Okay, good. So I know we've stolen a couple of minutes from Stephanie. So if everyone's comfortable, we'll move on to administrative updates.
That's okay. So this is just to call to your attention that the Joint Boards of Education Wellness Committee met earlier this week. We are in our regular process of doing the triannual assessment of our wellness policy, and our new business manager, working with the state guidelines and the state tools, has conducted the wellness assessment, which includes interviews and dare I say surveys of a number of different people to gather information, not just about the policy itself, but also the implementation of the policy, the communication of the policy, et cetera. It's actually in some ways quite useful to have a new person in the position, because things that those of us who have been around for a while know exist are not necessarily clear to someone coming in, which I think speaks more to communication than anything else. But I'm bringing this to your attention because at some point in the weeks ahead, I will be bringing a draft revision of the wellness policy to this committee for your review and discussion. And then the second item is simply to confirm that with respect to the DEI surveys, they have been sent to our legal counsel for a final review, and we will, of course, be following the board policy 6162.51 with respect to the survey of students. And while the actual form that's attached to that policy in its entirety will not necessarily be included in the communication to parents, the salient points that are in that form will be a part of the process. As you all know, we intend to use PowerSchool, and our PowerSchool manager is working now to sort of ready the website for the distribution of the parent information in the parent portal, so that the parent is logging in and makes an informed decision about providing active consent or not for each child in the system, which means that it has to be set up in such a way so that the parent is able to view the relevant information for each student if they're at a different level.
Yep. Yeah, and we've said on many occasions as a part of sort of the work that we've been doing for the policy committee, and we've communicated this back to our respective boards that sort of regs and forms and all that, that's not policy. That's just helpful sort of collateral that can be used, but the policy is the policy, not the forms. Okay, good. Anybody else have anyone have questions for Dr. Pearson Hugo? Okay, go to public comment. Any members of the public wishing to make comment can use the raise hand function in the participant window. Okay, hearing none. Committee member comment? Hearing none, look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Gwen. Seconded by Chris.
Second, sure.
Thank you. All in favor? Unanimously adjourned at 9:56 a.m. Thanks, everybody.